Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Joint Center Bioethics Seminar Series through the University of Toronto. I'm Andrea Bianchi, and I'll be the moderator for today's session. Our speakers are Andrew Helmers and Rashad Rehman, and their seminar is entitled 100 Years of Insulin, Medical Success, Ethical Mess. Before I introduce today's speakers, I'd like to let you know that the seminar is being recorded. This lecture, along with other archive lectures, can be accessed through the Joint Center for Bioethics website. The format of our seminar is a presentation by our speakers, followed by a facilitated discussion period. We wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. Andrew Helmers is a staff physician in the Department of Critical Care Medicine at the Hospital for Sick Children and an assistant professor in the Department of Pediatrics at the University of Toronto. He completed his MSc at the University of Toronto and medical training at McGill University, followed by pediatric and pediatric critical care training at the Hospital for Sick Children. Most recently, he completed, my apologies for the child in the background, he completed an MHSc in bioethics through the Dalai Lama School of Public Health at the University of Toronto in 2020. He is a clinical bioethics associate with the Department of Bioethics at the Hospital for Sick Children. He's also the chair of the Critical Care Infection Prevention and Control Committee and the associate medical director for Sick Kids Acute Care Transport Service. Andrew's research interests encompass pediatric pediatric best interests, fiduciary duty, communication, and professionalism. Rashad Rehman is a PhD student in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Toronto and a collaborative specialist in bioethics for the Joint Center for Bioethics at the University of Toronto. His dissertation research contributes to ongoing bioethical questions in pediatric bioethics, specifically the optimization of care for individuals who are born with differences or disorders of sexual development and intersexuality. Invested also in research ethics, Rashad is a TCPS2 certified student member on the Social Sciences, Humanities, and Education Research Ethics Board, and a volunteer researcher at Mount Sinai Hospital under senior bioethicist Dr. Rebecca Greenberg. I'll pass it over to the two of you for your presentation now.
Thank you, Andrea.
Thank you. All right, so just two notes right off the bat. So the first is that there is no conflicts of interest to disclose. And the second is that we want to acknowledge that the wealth of the primary material that you're going to see today is freely available through the U of T archives material. So we want to thank the University of Toronto for freely making this material accessible for us and also for the wider public intellectual community.
Yeah, we're very privileged that we can present material that is widely available, and it's always great to see things from their source. So you'll see a lot of original writing and letters and so forth from the time of insulin's discovery. The outline of our talk will go through a brief history of insulin's discovery. We'll then move into a discussion of research ethics and whether they were perhaps lacking, if only on surface look, in the discovery of insulin itself. We'll focus then on a discussion about self-experimentation in particular as one of the modes of research that was carried out during insulin's discovery, and then talk finally about the ultimate legacy of the team led by Banting and Best. In terms of the diabetes itself, I wanted to start with this, which is a copy of the chart of the first patient who ever received insulin, and that's Leonard Thompson. He's a 13-year-old. You can see from his address, he lived here in Toronto in the Beaches. And I wanted to point out that this child who was diagnosed with diabetes was admitted to hospital, Toronto General Hospital, from December 2nd, 1921 until May 15th, 1922. And just for some perspective in terms of the impact of the discovery of insulin, when we treat children in our ICU now at Sick Kids who present with diabetic ketoacidosis, the length of their admission is sometimes measured in hours, and very rarely more than a day, compared to the months which children had to spend in hospital when they were diagnosed in the era before insulin's discovery. So just to put all of this in a bit of perspective. A brief intro to what is diabetes. So diabetes mellitus, which is called because it's the sort of Greek and Latin derivatives for sweet tasting urine, because that was a big part of how it was diagnosed in the old days, was by taste. And it's a disease in which the body stops producing insulin. And so many cells in the body are thus unable to metabolize glucose, to take glucose from the blood into the cell and make energy from that. Before the discovery of insulin, diabetes was really a death sentence, and children, young adults, and older adults who were diagnosed with diabetes would often live for an average of about 3 years beyond the point of their diagnosis, which is in stark contrast with today. Death would occur typically through diabetic ketoacidosis, or DKA. The team that discovered insulin, many of them are familiar to you. Often mistakenly, people think that Banting and Best were the ones who won the Nobel Prize for this work, but it was a team effort. Banting and Best carried out experiments in the lab of J.J.R. Macleod at the University of Toronto, and James Collip was a biochemist who was essential to the final purification of insulin as a product. The Nobel Prize in 1923 was awarded actually to Banting and Macleod, and they subsequently shared the prize, Banting with Best and Macleod with Collip. To just bring everyone onto the same page, and this has some relevance to our later discussion in terms of what this team actually did, is that they realized that a big challenge facing researchers at the time was how to isolate insulin itself. And the pancreas, where insulin is made, makes digestive enzymes and it makes hormones. When you grind up a pancreas, it effectively digests itself. And up to the point at which Banting and Best entered the scene, no one had been able to grind up a pancreas and end up getting a hormone out of there, end up getting insulin out. What Banting and Best realized is that if you tie off the duct that drains the digestive enzymes into the gut from the pancreas, and then go back after a couple of weeks, that pancreas no longer has digestive enzymes in it. And so you can then grind it up and extract the hormones that you're interested in. They did this work in dogs, and that's relevant again to some of our discussion later on. But fundamentally, we're able to move very quickly through a program of research with a massive impact. To give a sense of the timeline, which puts even contemporary discoveries such as COVID-19 vaccines, for example, almost to shame, Banting first had an idea in the fall of 1920. He approached Macleod, who operated the lab at University of Toronto. Experiments began in May 1921, and this was Banting with the help of medical student Charles Best. By November 1921, they'd succeeded in keeping a depancreatized dog alive using extracts of insulin hormone that were taken from that dog's pancreas. James Collip joined the team in December of 1921 to continue in efforts to further purify the hormone. They had an initial clinical use in 1921 December, ineffective. That was the oral route. Then they moved forward into injections, which is still an important part of how insulin is delivered today. And as I showed you that chart from Leonard Thompson, is the first patient ever to receive insulin on a clinical basis. And that was in January 1922, less than a year after they first began their experiments. And the impact was quite immediate and widespread. This is another one of the early patients, little Teddy Ryder. And you can see a before and after, 1922 and 1923, just the extent to which a child who was dying effectively was brought back to life and lived for another 50 years after this. So this is, it was a dramatic and highly sensationalized discovery, rightly so. And the utilitarians among us might stop there and say, mission accomplished. Doesn't matter how they got there. It doesn't matter how they achieved what they did, because what they achieved was so great. The scope of their work was incredible. But we would like to turn the clock back and reflect on how exactly did the team get here in terms of the ethics with which they approached their discovery. What we're not advocating for is that we somehow cancel poor Dr. Banting, as it were. But we do want to review a couple of things. On the one hand, wanted to outline what at face value does seem to be a litany of historical research ethics violations by the team. But we also want to highlight that behind that was perhaps an informal but very real moral compass that informed the work that was done. And in particular, Dr. Banting, and we'll focus a lot on his work, his writings to illustrate what we're the thread that we're trying to weave here through this story. And in particular, I wanted to focus on the altruism that was, manifested by the self-experimentation that the team undertook, but also by their generous surrendering of the patents for insulin And we'll outline that in a moment. I'll move forward now, turn things over to Rashad.
Great. So in this portion of the talk, what we're going to essentially do is contextualize insulin's discovery within the framework of research ethics, thinking about the extent to which research ethics was simply not present at the time of the discovery of insulin. Next slide. So it's worthwhile to note that if we're thinking about the sort of modern research ethics paradigm today, this comes sort of directly from the Nuremberg Code, which was the first formal and crystallized ethical guideline for conducting medical research. And it was ultimately created to prophylactically prevent post-World War II unethical research practices. Since the Nuremberg Code, there have been many research ethics statements and documents globally, like the Helsinki, the Geneva, and the Belmont documents, which essentially enforce a sort of a research ethics paradigm which protects human subjects who are participants in research. In Canada, more close to home, research involving human beings is subjected to the Tri-Council Policy Statement, Ethical Conduct for Research Involving Humans, abbreviated as the TCP2S2. So there's a few reasons why we need research ethics. So first of all, understanding the risks and benefits to research, protecting vulnerable populations from unethical research, understanding the nature of risk in various experiments, but also just the general principle that harm should be reduced as much as possible in the context of research, transparency and accountability, holding those who are conducting experiments accountable for their research practices. But that doesn't mean that research ethics interventions are without some of their drawbacks. For example, they can be costly, they can be time ineffective. And what we're going to notice most striking in the context of insulin is that it can actually be prohibitive. It can prevent certain kinds of discoveries from being made in virtue of protecting human beings from various kinds of experiments.
So with the enlightened modern lens of the well-established research ethics oversight, we wanted to look back and outline what are some of the things that Banting and Best undertook that, at least on face value, appear to be egregious violations of what we conceive of as research ethics today. So one important one, and this was, arguably a novel contribution on our part in terms of finding textual evidence for this, is self-experimentation. It's alluded to in a number of sources in terms of the accounts of those who discovered insulin. And what we identified is in one of the laboratory notebooks in November 1921, there's a text here, and just to read the writing here, one of us, and it's FGB, so Frederick Banting, had 1.5 cc's or milliliters of Best's extract subcutaneously, and no reaction was documented. So there's evidence here of something that is still to this day a bit of a taboo in research ethics, and we'll discuss that in more depth later. Another area in which controversy arose is animal research. So again, this was work that was done by Banting and Best without the oversight of the animal sort of rights lobby, without oversight from the university in any way in terms of what is ethical conduct with animals as research subjects. And this probably drove some of the more negative press for Banting and Best in the day. And you can see some of these articles, a cartoon depicting Banting and describing him as the vivisector. Now I'm just going to cut out your pancreas and then you'll get diabetes. So this sort of, characterizing Banting and Best as sort of torturing animals. And we'll talk about, we'll present our response to these sort of accusations in a moment. Another interesting phenomenon that the group engaged in is, using a friend as guinea pig. And one physician who is a friend and classmate of Banting's is Joseph Gilchrist. And he served almost literally as a guinea pig for Banting throughout the time of insulin's discovery. So there's a note card here documenting Joseph Gilchrist, as being the first recipient of insulin. This is when they tried giving it orally and it didn't work. Of course, Dr. Gilchrist was diabetic. He developed diabetes not long before Banting and Best undertook their experiments. And as a diabetic, he would often go to Banting and was keen to be the one who could trial the discovery that was ongoing. And there's further notes later, because Dr. Gilchrist worked at Christie Street Hospital for veterans, where he describes Dr. Gilchrist as saying, I doubt if there is a person in the world who has had his veins punctured so many times. He had abscesses at the site of injection on very many occasions. So this is Banting's account describing how frequently and enthusiastically Dr. Gilchrist would take the insulin samples that were provided as part of their work. So again, this would be conceived of today as probably an important conflict of interest, perhaps, but one that was quite a fundamental part of the early work in the discovery of insulin. And a final area in which the team seemed to fall short is that of informed consent. This is Banting's writing describing the discovery of insulin. And there are a few things I would highlight here. It's a bit of a busy slide, I apologize, lots of close handwriting, but there's a few things here. One is that Banting highlights or describes this first clinical use of insulin on that boy, Leonard Thompson, as a, quote, human experiment, unquote. He also points out that both he and Best did not have hospital privileges. Sounds like hospital politics were at least as bad then as sometimes they are these days. And he was having trouble getting a clinical appointment at Toronto General Hospital. And so on that basis was denied access to patients in terms of discussing things with them, getting their consent and so forth. So there was almost a necessary lack of informed consent in that first use of insulin. And I'll highlight those conclusions here. So on the one hand, yes, conceptualizing the first clinical use as a human experiment of sorts, but also articulating an inability to engage with patients in any kind of informed consent process. No contact with the patient. And interestingly, the hospital, Toronto General Hospital, insisted on doing their own analysis of samples and so forth, and retained ownership of the biologic samples, urine and blood testing for sugars. So this was a process that, for Banting and for Best, meant a lack of contact with the very research subjects that they were working with indirectly. Further, a number of other subjects for their testing, as it were, involved veterans at the hospital that I mentioned already, the Christie Street Hospital, where Dr. Joseph Gilchrist was on staff. And so this is a newspaper article documenting really some protests against this work by a veterans association in Parkdale in Toronto, and describing, and you can see in the second panel here, to us it seems only in accordance with the prevalent grateful treatment of men whose frames have been appallingly racked on the battlefield that they should be administered extracts that throw them into convulsions or cause them to climb the walls of the experimental chamber of torture. So maybe dramatic language, but again, this is pointed criticisms, even in the contemporary times in which they lived, of work with vulnerable patients, in this case, veterans, and accusing them of perhaps doing this without the appropriate and necessary consent. We'll turn things back over to Rashad to discuss self-experimentation in particular.
Great, thanks very much. So of all the aforementioned transgressions or allegations made against Banting and his team, we wanted to focus on self-experimentation in our research and in this presentation for two reasons. So the first is that the evidence presented here today is a unique and novel contribution, as it hasn't been previously noted in any of the insulin literature, the literature relevant to insulin. And secondly, while regulatory oversight governing informed consent, animal research, and vulnerable population protections has evolved over the past century, the role of self-experimentation has remained firmly in the moral gray. When research ethics boards in 2019, one of the best studies on this was in 2019, research ethics boards members were contacted and they were asked, what do you think about self-experimentation and how does it feature? And there was a significant divide on it. And so since it sits in the moral gray, there are ethical considerations which warrant further explication. So just a reminder here of a slide that Dr. Helmers had shown before. And this reminds us that, so this dates from November 1921, 100 years ago, when the focus of work remained on animal experimentation. So the purpose of self-injection of the extract would be a remote, not immediately preclinical assessment of purity to test, for example, for local reaction. So in other words, it's not surprising that this is the only example we can find in notebooks from summer to fall 1921. There are firsthand accounts of Banting and Best engaging in dose-determining self-injections immediately prior to clinical use in January 1922. But it is important to note that we have no textual or lab book correlate from as records from January to February 1922, since they're oddly missing. So Banting notes that on November 23rd, 1921, less than 2 months before its first clinical use, he self-injected subcutaneously 1.5 cc or milliliters of Best's insulin extract, perhaps to understand the local reaction that might stem from any impurities in the preparation. In his 1940, The Story of the Discovery of Insulin, Banting writes that the motivation for self-injection, closer to its clinical use in January 1922, was simply calculatory. This is how we read it. Best and I carefully tested a batch of extract and calculated the dose for a human. And this here, of course, is just the documentation or the sort of primary evidence for this claim. This is exactly where the quote is taken from. And so this confirms the immediate preclinical role of self-experimentation, a role that to some extent today might be fulfilled by phase 1 trials today. Principle 5 of the Nuremberg Code of Research Ethics states, no experiment should be conducted where there is an a priori reason to believe that death or disabling injury will occur, except perhaps in those experiments where the experimental physicians also serve as subjects. So self-experimentation does feature, for example, on the Nuremberg Code of Research Ethics. However, something that's striking is that in the TCPS2, self-experimentation isn't featured. And so there's a question here of, well, okay, so we understand that research ethics intervention is important for all of the various reasons that were listed before, but let's not even ask the normative question yet of whether self-experimentation ought to be a practice within research ethics, but what historically are the reasons why self-experimentation has been chosen instead of ordinary research involving participants other than the researchers themselves? So there's at least 5 reasons that are envisioned. So the first is learning what subjects to a protocol would experience, and noticing effects that might be missed when operating through the relative distance of others. Second, providing an initial test to confirm that research performed in animals can be translated to humans. Avoidance of the considerable amount of time, expense, and red tape of conducting experiments on others. To pilot on one person an experimental procedure that would be impractically resource intensive or expensive if performed on many people. And finally, proving that something is safe or true when no one else will believe you, which of course is very common historically. So we shift then from the descriptive question to the normative question. So the question of, whether there are good arguments in favor of self-experimentation and whether there are good arguments against it. So arguments against self-experimentation might be on moral grounds. So for example, moral acts of supererogation, which are those moral duties which are above and beyond the call to duty, not just ordinary moral obligations. Perhaps these should be as limited as much as possible in research ethics, and they should be incentivized. And it's not clear, for example, whether research ethics merits self-experimentation. It's like a proportionality claim. But it could also be, and it also has been challenged on scientific grounds. The thought is that it's generally unreliable and ineffective, and historic cases are limited with respect to what they show. They're dangerous in some cases, certainly, and there's a lack of accountability that seems to be integral to research ethical practices. Arguments for self-experimentation, on the other hand, might be pretty obviously utilitarian in nature, in that there's extremely good consequences to self-experimenting, at least in some cases. And so that seems to provide at least some justification for its practice. And again, you might think that, for example, if a researcher wants to perform this moral act of supererogation from altruistic motivations, that they should be very well in their rights to do so. And again, you might say, for example, in the same kind of way against self-experimentation, there might be a scientific case for it. So this would be sort of an inductive generalization based on some of the examples of self-experimentation's efficacy historically. And even today, for example, there's still examples of scientists who still self-experiment for some of the reasons that we mentioned before. One question that we have for our research, and this is genuinely a question, is whether there's a moderate kind of proposal that's made between the sort of extremes of self-experimentation as a practice that ought to be, for example, encouraged, as well as thinking about the negative drawbacks from the sort of licensing of self-experimentation in general. So if we look at the chart here, for example, we notice that So this is a Nobel Prize list in which the Nobel Prize winners have self-experimented. And Banting actually does feature on this list, of course. So it says 1923 insulin, with the fourth person down, gave himself mustard gas burns to test treatment. So this is actually a little bit of a mistake. Go next slide. So he had previously engaged in self-experimentation during his work to explore therapies for mustard gas, trying to combat some of the really disastrous consequences of chemical warfare. And so he was familiar with this contemporary research approach. But what the last slide also showed us fundamentally was that Banting wasn't alone historically among other scientists who also self-experimented in their work. So putting him in his historical context, he certainly wasn't an isolated figure. And something important to note about self-experimentation here is that it's not clear, making a counterfactual claim, whether insulin would have been discovered had it not been for the absence of research ethics intervention. By today's standards, research ethics intervention, first of all, would have been required. And REBs are themselves divided on self-experimentation. And of course, they screen for unethical research. But suppose that this would have been the case, that it wouldn't have been discovered. What does self-experimentation say about REB's limitations, especially with the discovery, for example, of insulin on the line? And this is a quote from Banting's The Story of the Discovery of Insulin. "To me, sentiment is not a thing of which one should feel ashamed. To some, science is cold and naturalistic without feeling or heart, but a man cannot be discovered from his work." And so something that we're going to reflect on later in the presentation is what it is that we get to learn about Banting and his team from his work itself. Right? On the one hand, we might think that there are certain kinds of problematic aspects, but on the other, there's this significant altruistic motivation to self-experiment, which is informative for researchers today. We're going to pass it back off to Dr. Helmers.
Thanks, Rashad. And as Rashad's commenting with that quotation from Frederick Banting, this is now where we move to look at, what was the fundamental orientation of the team in that day? What was their moral compass, as it were? And I wanted to respond in part to the different accusations that we leveled against the team already in terms of the sort of litany of research ethics violations that they were potentially guilty of. So first of all, in spite of the absence, as it were, of formal research ethics oversight in their day, their discovery of insulin was not an amoral undertaking. It was not something which, based on our look at the textual evidence, seems to have taken place in a moral vacuum of any kind. They seem to endorse consistently throughout their work very much an altruistic motivation, inclusive of methods such as self-experimentation. They also endorse on a number of occasions a familiarity with the Hippocratic Oath, for example, and endorsing a real fiduciary duty towards their patients as patients and as research subjects. They also articulate an extensive concern for animals used in their research and a familiarity with contemporary medical ethics. So we'll explore all of these in turn. To start with the last point, this is an extract from one of Banting's notebooks where he scribbles down reference here, Medical Ethics by Robert Sonby. And what he's referring to here is what was one of the preeminent texts in medical ethics of the day. So this is an example of an edition published in 1907. And it, I think, just puts in context that, Banting was not someone who ignored that facet of his work and seems to have engaged with the relevant literature of the time. And I think that's an important thing to put out there, that even though as medical ethics was conceived of, that it was not inclusive in those days of a formalized approach to research ethics, nevertheless, there was a notion of ethics that wasn't invented, in the Nuremberg trials. In terms of the prior criticisms regarding informed consent, this is from Banting's writings about the work that he did on veterans. And he writes here, "It is to be remembered that it was still in the experimental stage, insulin that is, and each man was required to sign a paper which stated that the treatment had been explained to him and that he submitted to it voluntarily, and that he would not hold us responsible for untoward results." And comments that yes, at first there was no great enthusiasm either, and certainly his friendship with Gilchrist was a factor here in convincing some of the veterans to take part in this study. But you can see here an articulation of informed consent that is not so distant from how we conceive of it today. Further, in response to the criticism that was published that I presented earlier from the Veterans Association, a number of the veterans that were involved at that hospital submitted a declaration to the Toronto Star subsequently, which is copied here. And what they wrote is basically, they put their names and said that I had Dr. Banting's treatment thoroughly explained to me and understand that it has not yet reached a stage of finality, that there is, in connection with the treatment, some experimental work to be done, and also that there is an element of risk in that it is not yet fully known just what the treatment will do. I am taking treatment on my own decision with the above in mind. So again, an articulation of participants in that study being aware of the notion of informed consent. In terms of animal research, a comment here in the writing of Banting, where he writes, and quite striking, in fact, I've always felt that a dog should be, as far as possible, treated like a human with regard to operation, aftercare, nursing, drawing of blood, and nothing should be done to cause pain unless necessary, and that an anesthetic should be used as it would be in the care of a private patient. So, Banting was, and this is one of many pages we found in which he really sort of waxed poetic about his dedication to animal welfare and his care for animals. I think, Rashad, you had a comment here as well.
Yeah. So it's just an observation about the text. So Banting says a lot of things about animals, so some of which is highlighted here. But he also has this deep personal sense of ethical responsibility towards animals that isn't based on formal legalistic moral principles. He says, for example, that he thinks that only those who have a natural affection for animals should be allowed to experiment on them, right? So he makes this phenomenological claim about how animals ought to be treated, and it's remarkable how much attention he really does give this. Thanks, Dr. Arnold.
The world of animal research regulation is involves pages and pages of policies, and which are all, of course, very important in protecting animals as vulnerable research subjects. But what Banting writes is almost a preface to that work. It's really that sort of respect for animals that is meant to permeate the various policies that we endorse today. Moving to discuss self-experimentation, and I know Rashad has already treated of this in depth, but on the one hand, you might think that in lieu of phase 1 trials, which are in some sense a modern response to the phenomenon of self-experimentation that may have been more widespread earlier on, you might point out that it's perhaps surprising that there isn't more textual evidence in the case of Banting and Best. And as Rashad pointed out, we managed to find one example, but this was at a phase in research when the work of Banting and Best was primarily assessing its effectiveness in animals rather than preclinical. For whatever reason, the notebooks for Banting and Best and their team are missing for January 1922, which is when they did the majority of their initial clinical work, and where you might expect to see much more documentation of self-injecting and so forth. But all we have for that are their own accounts of that work. When you look at self-experimentation, though, there's really two ways you might see it, right? On the one hand, you might see it as a grotesque sort of means to fame and fortune, a way to accelerate their glory. Or you could see that as a very patient-centered, high-stakes battle against a deadly disease. And I would argue that second is the case here, that the motivation for their self-experimentation stemmed from what they saw as their fiduciary duty to patients in the face of a disease that they had a better and growing understanding of. Just to highlight the stakes that they were working against. So this is another extract from Banting's writings. He says that a young lady was admitted to the Toronto General Hospital in diabetic coma. Campbell, one of the physicians they worked with, obtained some of the new refined product from Collip and gave it to the girl. She showed marked improvement. She came almost out of coma, but there was no more insulin to give her. Collip worked frantically, but could make none. The patient relapsed and died. So as they were beginning their clinical use of insulin, there was a struggle for several months to refine the product so that it could be consistently prepared in a pure form and in a manner that was effective. And they were really racing against the clock. In some cases, even with a single patient, they were not able to keep that patient alive because of an inability to make enough insulin. So they saw the stakes as very high, and that seems to have been an important factor compelling, for example, the self-experimentation that they undertook. And part of our argument that this was globally part of the team's altruism is that famously, the group surrendered their patent to the University of Toronto after registering their discovery. They only actually registered 4 patents for one important reason, and that was to safeguard the process by which insulin is produced and to prevent the contemporary sort of quackery, where others might riff on the ingredients for insulin and produce inferior products in order to exploit something. So they were convinced that they should patent the work. In other words, safeguard the proper way to make insulin in its most potent form. But they sold this to the University of Toronto for a symbolic $1. Banting's name appears finally on the patent here, but initially he didn't even want to have his name on a patent at all. But they surrendered all interest to the University of Toronto. And again, the reasons for this were grounded in what seems to have been a well thought out, at least personal sort of ethics. This was a statement by Macleod, who again was their supervisor, as it were. And he wrote that, since, however, it is contrary to the traditional principles of the medical profession to restrict the production or supply of any substance that may be used for the alleviation of human suffering, and is contrary to its ethical code for any physician to derive financial benefit from the sale of such substance, it was decided that the patent should be assigned to the Board of Governors of the University of Toronto to be held by them for the sole purpose of preventing any other person from taking out a similar patent which might restrict the preparation of insulin. So again, this was a generous move from the team, but one that stemmed from what they saw as an ethical obligation in this case. Banting as well, in a letter that he wrote, spoke of the act of taking out a patent for what we hope will prove to be a remedial agent of considerable value has awakened a great deal of criticism, more especially since I am a graduate in medicine and bound by its ethical code as contained in the Hippocratic oath taken by me on obtaining this degree. I think he spells Hippocratic wrong here, but such as it is. So what that leaves us with is asking, what are some lessons for the modern age, as it were, from the team that discovered insulin? I think, we've walked through what are some important ways in which the team violated modern standards of research ethics. And I think an important conclusion to get out there up front is that research ethics oversight is a good thing. It's clear from just that brief look we've taken that anyone with bad intentions or a bad idea could do a great deal of harm in the so-called good old days. There was clear dangers posed by the shortcuts that were taken. On the other hand, the moral compass of that team, in spite of a lack of formal research ethics oversight, was not completely malaligned, and in fact seemed to be quite well oriented towards the good of their patients. And by contrast, looking at the modern research ethics enterprise, there are occasions in which you might see that as being overly narrow or siloed in its scope. While research ethics boards are quite effective at safeguarding the vulnerable patients who are subjects of research studies, the question remains, who safeguards those patients when research agendas are set in the first place, or when research findings are commercialized? Where does research ethics fit within a broader fiduciary outlook? Because its scope has become in some ways incredibly constrained and perhaps disconnected from the sort of clinical ethics. Today, in fact, in some cases, research ethics seems to end where patents begin, whereas for Banting and Best, the ethics of their research included a notion of patents as being secondary to patients. And they really saw the primary thrust of a continuum of clinical and research work as being patient-centered. And remarkably, maintaining that goal even when the lure of profits was there, because as you can imagine, if they had patented and not surrendered that patent to the university, they would have been very quick millionaires and billionaires, as Pfizer has become in the wake of their COVID vaccines. So to what extent, we have to ask, I think, do modern research ethics boards fail to empower an inclusive big picture? Who sets big budget research agendas? Are those laid out with ethical oversight? And are those same patients who are safeguarded by REDs during a research trial able to afford the treatments discovered by those trials? Ironically, the dangers that plague sort of profiteering in medicine that was renounced by Banting and Best have come back to haunt insulin in particular, which has really spiraled out of control in the US in particular. There are some recent efforts to rein that in, but there's countless articles outlining what is aptly described here as the absurdly high costs of insulin, and that would be, I'm sure, have Banting turning in his grave. And at the end of the day, I think we can argue that Banting and Best may not leave a legacy of how research ought to be conducted, but I think do importantly leave us with lessons governing, for whom research is done, and leave us wondering how we might recapture that spirit in those places where it may be lost. I've alluded to this already, but I would argue that Banting would probably approve of the speed of the COVID-19 vaccine development, which mirrors the speed of their discovery of insulin. But I don't think he would approve of the billions of dollars in profits that have come, and at the lack of patent sharing with lower income countries throughout this. I'll end with a little selection here. This is a letter to Banting from one of his early patients, where she writes, "Dear Dr. Banting, I'm feeling so good and getting so much to eat. I get oatmeal and potato. I was in the Halloween parade and got a prize. Here are some pictures, don't I look fat?" By a patient who was previous, of course, quite cachectic and wasting away. And this, these letters stayed in Banting's possession. They're an important part of the files that are shared by the extensive archives at the University of Toronto, and clearly were incredibly meaningful to him and to his team. And that was the reward he was looking for. That was the reward, not the profits that would have come from that work. And I think if that's the only lesson that we can draw from insulin's discovery, I think it's a very meaningful one. Thank you very much for your time and attention. This is our email addresses. I'm happy to be contacted with any questions. And we do have in very fine print here some references, which we're also happy to share at anyone's request. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for that fascinating presentation, and my apologies again for the sick child in the background who's a bit noisy. We do have some questions, so I'll jump into it. One of the first questions that came in is, isn't there a significant survivorship bias among self-experimentation reports? So should we really believe that the evidence of self-experimentation is strong?
Rashad, do you want to tackle that?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So I'm not sure I fully understand in what sense the question's being asked.
I think it may be concerning, that it can go both ways, right? There may be many who self-experiment and that's the end of it because it doesn't work or is fatal or dangerous or otherwise. And all we see from our standpoint are the successes, the ones who have, for example, powered through and made a Nobel Prize winning discovery of something like H. pylori, which was a famous recent example. And I'm sure that's the case. I think what that highlights for me, and I don't know if you agree with this, Rashad, but that what we see in that table with the Nobel Prize winners who self-experimented is the tip of the iceberg. And I would argue that there are probably countless individuals who engaged in self-experimentation and continue to do so without that being formalized in any way, without that being confessed, without that being documented. So I think there's a survivorship bias in the extent to which it is known or appreciated as being a practice, and I think its use probably extends far beyond that, and that may be an argument for it getting some attention by research ethics boards in an effort to limit the dangers that it might entail.
Certainly. And the only thing that I would add is that table that was shown with the Nobel Prize winners was sort of limited in many kinds of ways. One of which, of course, is just that, yeah, I mean, it's sort of explicitly a table just to show that self-experimentation has at least some utilitarian justification, or at least if you're making a moral judgment about self-experimentation, that these utility considerations will factor in. And some of those high-stake cases which resulted in Nobel Prize winning discoveries were sort of involved in self-experimentation's history.
Thank you so much for that. And so a couple of questions have come in actually around this concept of trust. And so one of the questions is, if research ethics may end when patents begin, so I think reflecting upon some of your more recent statements in the presentation, Dr. Helmers, it seems like this would influence trust. And so how can we go about building trust within the non-scientific community when it comes to products that are benefiting companies as a consequence of successful research? And someone else also asked, just how do you think that we can actually trust the results of self-experimentation, especially when the investigators would obviously have a very strong bias in terms of the results they're looking for. So if you could speak to a little bit around just trust and self-experimentation and public perceptions.
Yeah, and I think many have pointed to, for example, contemporary profiteering during COVID as undermining trust in many ways, especially when the groundwork for the science that built vaccines, for example, for COVID-19, came from a lot of public monies and years of public investment into an extensive research enterprise. And I think that one way to regain that trust or prevent that trust being lost on future occasions is, and then this may be a very Canadian rather than the sort of pure capitalist American viewpoint, but a greater degree of regulation of pharmaceutical interest in these things, right? That sense of there's a public stake in the outcomes of a lot of research, and arguably all research, and certainly to the extent that research brings a real clinical bedside benefit, to patients, to individuals across the country, that it feels that there needs to be oversight built into the very beginning of certain research undertakings in terms of who's going to be accountable at the end of the day to ensure that discovery is accessible, is available in an equitable manner to those who maybe otherwise wouldn't even be able to afford it because of the manner in which the pharmaceutical industry might profit from it after it's received the approvals down the road. I don't know if that addresses that. Rashad, did you want to talk about trust and self-experimentation?
Yeah, certainly. So coming at it just from a more philosophical angle, I think it's important to note that, part of what we're trying to do is a good bit of testimonial justice towards Banting, especially in his writing. So one of the indicators of a reliable testifier, for example, will be sort of the peripheral context in which he's writing. So for example, based on the writing that we have from Banting in other regards, given a good bit of, given the fact that he's truthful in a great deal of cases, especially with respect to, the reporting of the various stages of insulin's development, but also just historically what we know about its discovery or about its production in general. From this, we can infer that unless we've got some good reason to deny that the account is mistaken in some sense, then we can trust his testimony. There's also just a principle of credulity that we abide by in taking these accounts seriously, unless we're, forced in some sense to give up, trusting Banting's account. And so for those kinds of reasons, we take his account pretty seriously. But sorry, I want to also say that we don't generalize this to every case. So whether certain kinds of testifiers are to be trusted in other cases of self-experimentation, we don't take a really strong stake on, I don't think. And so how that generalizes into REB considerations, I don't think we take too hard of a stance on it. Maybe Dr. Helmers does, but at least in the case of Banting, that the reasons that I specified would be why we take his testimony seriously and to be truthful.
I think to the extent that research ethics boards generally, don't look kindly on self-experimentation for the reasons that Rashad outlined, it's hard to imagine that such work would engender trust in itself. I think there's a backward-looking trust, the sort of utilitarian, like, well, this worked, and and let's give you a Nobel Prize and trust your, the thread of your research that led you to this. But that's the exception, and I think generally speaking, it'd be hard to argue that a priority, that there would be trust in someone who's self-experimenting in the absence of REB approval, because for better or worse, the REB is the gatekeeper often of the trust that we invest in researchers.
Thank you so much. And there's certainly a lot there just in relation to trust and perhaps the lack of, or how trust may be influenced by a patent and by finances being involved, but then also this self-experimentation bit, which certainly adds something there. One of the points that I believe, Rehman, Rashad, you may have noted. Okay, yeah. So is just that you noted, I think it's you noted some arguments in favor of and against self-experimentation. The two arguments against self-experimentation were the scientific argument around self-experimentation and the results being ineffective or perhaps unreliable, and then this moral argument around the fact that we should limit supererogatory acts when it comes to research. And so a question was posed at the end of the slide around finding a middle ground. And so this person asks, could a middle ground to the arguments in favor of and against self-experimentation simply be finding ways to resolve the opposing arguments? So for example, if we are able to find ways to ensure reliability of self-experimentation reports, or if we can argue that actually supererogatory acts when it comes to research are defensible, then perhaps self-experimentation would just therefore be okay. Maybe that wouldn't be a middle ground per se, but that's just what this person is suggesting.
Yeah, that's I think a very welcome suggestion, certainly. So yeah, and yeah, this is a very welcome suggestion, just in the sense that, yeah, I mean, if you can show the reliability of self-experimentation, but also that the person who is self-experimenting is themselves reliable and are reporting truthful information, but also if you can show the defense of moral acts of supererogation on the part of researchers, then certainly that lends some credence to the view that that REBs should consider self-experimentation, for sure. Yeah, and I think that that's very much the proposal that, or the sort of moderate kind of solution that we're interested in as well. For the purpose of this talk, we were simply, laying out the reasons back and forth. But these kinds of considerations do admittedly lend credence to really having them involved in at least addressed explicitly in REB protocol, for sure. I don't know if you have anything to add, Dr. Helmers.
No, and I think that's the one sort of take home from all this is that Banting and Best's work, together with others who sort of high profile self-experimenters, as it were, have left us with this question hanging over us that I think is still in an important way unanswered, which is what is the role of self-experimentation, and again, given the extent to which REBs are the gatekeepers of public and private trust, really, in researchers and the research they do, and it's how should this remain a taboo, or should it be codified in some way as being not allowed or being permitted under certain circumstances? These are different things that I think remain to be considered today.
Lovely. And there's one more question. I think we might just have enough time for one more question. So this question or comment is just noting that social value is an important criterion for research to be considered ethical. Self-experimentation likely fails this criterion because of its inability to provide knowledge that can be extrapolated beyond the sample of one participant. So while not all research is generalizable, to be sure, the main value in doing the activity of research is to know if you have grounds to believe that applying the same intervention to another person is reliable. Beyond the knowledge gained by the investigator, it's hard to see the social value of this sort of experimentation. So perhaps you could speak a little bit about how self-experimentation could be seen as compatible with social value.
Yeah, I think if you, again, turn back the clock 100 years, I think it's maybe not so difficult to see in the time of Banting and Best, that for them, self-experimentation was the only way really that was seen as valid in those days in terms of translating, an animal experiment into a human experiment. Much of what they endeavored to do through self-experimentation, arguably today, would be done just as easily, if not more so, than with phase 1 trials, in which the safety of an agent is assessed after convincing animal studies have been done. And in that respect, I would not argue that there would be a social value to a Banting of today in terms of jumping to self-experimentation when there are other ways in which the same results can be achieved with better oversight, more reproducibility, and so forth. And I think it's an important comment in terms of before a research ethics board or any broader research ethics policies are brought to bear on self-experimentation, they're going to have to consider how today the scope of that sort of work is going to be extremely limited, right? And that scope would sometimes be precisely that N of 1. It's this work that certainly in the moment is potentially not reproducible and so forth. So definitely barriers there, and I think what we're arguing for the most part is that it's an interesting taboo that hasn't really been given full hearing by modern research ethics standards. But I'm not advocating that self-experimentation become the norm or even be allowed at all. I think it's an interesting reality of research 100 years ago that perhaps in some exceptional cases may have a role to play even to this day.
I suppose the only thing that I would add is just that I think that, so there are certain kinds of theoretical virtues that certain kinds of experiments take. One kind of theoretical virtue would be having social value, but there's a whole nexus and myriad of other kinds of values that experiments can have, such that I think that missing social value isn't, it certainly shows a limitation to these kinds of experiments, but it doesn't show in any sense that they're, for example, wrong, right? It's not a wrong-making feature of an experiment. And you might say, well, perhaps what this shows then is that it's somehow sub-scientific or something, right? Perhaps that, you can cast some doubt on whether this meets the full criteria, for example, for a scientific experiment. But I think that the tree is known by the fruit, right, in some sense. And so, even if it might have this sort of sub-scientific status, I still think that it does enjoy a certain kind of legitimacy, given that, fundamentally it works in some cases.
Thank you both. We actually just have one final question, if you're okay to take it at this moment. I'm just stepping in for Andrea. She had to move away from the computer because of her unfortunate assistant. So the question is it true that research ethics has become quite narrow in scope and identified more or less with the mandate of REBs? But the solution is not necessary to give REBs more scope. They are already beset with criticism from the research community. The solution may be to build ethical commitments into the research enterprise itself, not download it to the REBs. Comments?
Yeah, no, I agree 100%. And I think, almost to rephrase what I'd said, that research ethics, as an enterprise, right? So, transcending research ethics boards themselves, rather that we need to conceive of research ethics as something that certainly includes the important work that research ethics board does, but also includes, important administrative obligations in terms of setting research agendas, regulatory oversight that transcends a single institution, but can govern, what are the profiteering, downstream issues that might arise with certain research. And there are millions and billions of dollars put into various research projects, right? And I think one criticism that's come up, certainly more so over the past year, thankfully, is, to what extent is that modern research enterprise addressing, needs that speaks to an equitable approach to research agendas. Like are we putting millions and millions into AI when there are others who might benefit from an extensive look at how to solve food insecurity, things like this, right? So I think that's that agenda setting requires an ethical lens, I think, and I agree that that's not something that's going to be done by those sitting on research ethics boards themselves. They might have a voice in some of those bigger picture discussions, but I think there's absolutely a need for for something bigger that encompasses more than what the research ethics boards can accomplish.
Yeah, I second Dr. Helmer's response.
Okay, thanks very much for answering those questions. I'm just going to read our closing here. So it's time to draw today's seminar to a close. I have a couple of announcements to make before we thank our speakers. Our next bioethics seminar will take place on Wednesday, November 17th, and Gayeth Hussain will be discussing research or not research. This is not the question for public health emergencies. To sign up to receive our weekly seminar reminder emails, please email jcb.info@utoronto.ca. CSB students enrolled in the CSB Student Seminar course, please remember to keep track of your attendance. And Andrew and Rashad, on behalf of all of us, thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you, everyone, for your attention and attendance.
Thanks, everyone.